we've got the pleasure of being able to show a short trailer from an extraordinary new film that had its world debut last night at the New York Film Festival about Edward Snowden. It's called Citizen 4. It's directed by Laura Poitras, and it will have a theatrical opening elsewhere on October 24th. The New Yorker's wonderful writer, George Packer, has a piece about it in the upcoming issue, and it's up online now. The film is, I saw it last night, full of amazing real-time footage inside the hotel room in Hong Kong, where Snowden, Poitras, and 2 other reporters were holed up for days before his escape to Moscow. One small piece of news is the revelation that, isolated though Mr. Snowden's existence has been in Moscow, it just got a little less so starting in July. He was joined by his girlfriend then, who's been living with him, and it may be the most watched Russian romance in exile now since, I was thinking, since Julie Christie joined Dr. Zhivago. So, so let's look at the trailer and then we'll plunge into the interview.
Laura, at this stage I can offer nothing more than my word. I am a senior government employee in the intelligence community. I hope you understand that contacting you is extremely high risk. For now, know that every border you cross, every purchase you make, every call you dial, every cell phone tower you pass, friend you keep, site you visit, and subject line you type is in the hands of a system whose reach is unlimited, but whose safeguards are not. In the end, if you publish the source material, I will likely be immediately implicated. I ask only that you ensure this information makes it home to the American public. Thank you, and be careful. Citizen 4.
Sorry, I don't know anything about you.
Okay, I work for...
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Oh, sorry. My name is Edward Snowden. I go by Ed. Edward Joseph Snowden's the full name.
So I think Citizen 4 is amazing in capturing in real time what was going on in that Moscow hotel room. And I think one thing it may put to bed are any concerns that some people have had, critics have had, that Edward Snowden might be a spy with some kind of nefarious master plan, because you see this scramble in this hotel room that made me want to ask my first question, which was, it seemed like the planning for distributing this information to the reporters was very careful that you did. You had 3 reporters, there'd be backups, and you took precautions on how to cover the security for that. But it was almost as if there was no end plan beyond that for yourself. And so it seemed when you first arrived, you were talking about, you know, you were the one who was going to be nailed to the cross, and that was, you were ready to deal with it. But eventually, as the days went on, it seemed like there was possibility that arrived for escape and maybe a way out of that box you were in that room. So what I wanted to know was, what was in your mind, what was your original game plan in terms of where you thought it would end then, and did new things open up while you were there that offered you maybe a way out?
So I would say, first off, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear out there? Okay.
So what I would say is, when I look back on that period and I look at everything that happened and how complex it was and how everybody was working, in incredible amounts of time, the journalists, to get this out, to coordinate with the National Security Agency, other intelligence community agencies, to basically make sure that nobody was going to be inappropriately harmed, no one was going to be put at risk by this. We were kind of overcome with a sense that there wasn't enough time to do anything, and this was going to continue and continue and continue. And this was a feeling that they were new to, but had been consuming me for quite some time. Because going forward, I had to recognize that this was something of which I was only a very small piece. I was the mechanism of presenting information that had been concealed from the American people that we needed to know. We had our most senior officials in government, whether it was James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, Keith Alexander, former Director of the NSA, they were giving sworn statements in front of Congress that were false. And we have video of that now and can look back. It's not really a question of dispute. But when it gets to that level of severity, when the consequences for our democracy are so great, somebody has to step forward. But as far as what happens to them, that's an open question that they cannot answer. So when I discussed this with the journalists, I told them that my plan was not to decide for myself what should happen, but to ask the world for justice and go, look, are these programs consistent not only with national laws, but with international laws? How does it fit into a larger system, and what should happen? And it turned out that there were human rights lawyers who were very concerned about the things that had happened, and they began to advise me, and we moved forward from there.
So when you first went there, did you think you would be arrested, probably, and then it seemed possible that maybe you could get some sort of asylum?
The most likely scenario was always that I would be arrested and that I would get sent to jail. I don't think anybody on the team, whether it was myself, whether it was the lawyers, whether it was the journalists, had even imagined the situation would turn out like it eventually did. I mean, we were talking about some of the greatest and most sophisticated intelligence actors in the world, the world's sole superpower, and a number of officials, very powerful officials, who were personally embarrassed when it was revealed that, they had oversight over these things, and they had sort of abdicated that role. They had given up on controlling these programs and just said, look, don't tell us about it. We don't want to know about it. We don't care who it affects. We don't care about what impact it has on our system. Just keep it out of the public domain. So yeah, I think the most real moment where the fact that we had passed the Rubicon became absolutely clear to me was when Laura Poitras sat down in front of me and she turned the camera on. It was me and Glenn Greenwald. He was doing the initial vetting, which was actually a lot more like a cross-examination. He's pretty aggressive when it comes to interviewing somebody. And we both immediately stiffened. We froze up. We looked at each other, and it was very clear that there's no going back. The only way we can move at this point is forward, and simply do the best we can to make sure that all of our actions from this point forward serve the public interest.
I guess, the reason I ask is there have been people who've said to me sometimes, well, why didn't he decide to just, do this act of civil disobedience and then pay the consequences, be arrested, fight your fight in the courts, be like, Martin Luther King in the jail and writing from Montgomery. Did you ever contemplate possibly a scenario in which you might face American justice like that?
Well, absolutely. But I mean, the question there was, would the American justice system be open to that? And I looked at other cases previously from Thomas Drake, Chelsea Manning, all of the former whistleblowers, even people who weren't brought in front of courts, in the same manner, Bill Binney, Kirk Wiebe, Ed Loomis. But when we go back to Daniel Ellsberg, many, many years ago, we saw that he had the opportunity to stay free while he was in trial. He could go on the news, he could go to an open court, he could make the case in front of the jury, that what he did was he took his actions to champion the public interest. But in my case, and all of the cases of the last decade, we've seen that the way the law is being used in whistleblowing cases has changed. You're actually forbidden now from making a public interest defense if you're charged with under the Espionage Act, which are the charges they brought against me. Every country in the world actually recognizes the Espionage Act as what's called a political crime, which means it's not extraditable, and that it's not considered actually a legitimate charge. And that's because the crime that they're saying, the victim is not an individual. Like assassination is not actually considered a political crime because the victim is a person, it's an individual, it's someone who can be harmed. A political crime is what they call an act that's taken against an actual state, not individuals, but the state itself, not a nation, but the institutions of state, when you're challenging policies, when you're challenging laws. And normally, whenever these cases happen, you're allowed to address the jury. You're allowed to say, you know, we may disagree, and you may find me guilty. You may say, you know, I am a criminal, I deserve to go to prison, but you'll allow me to make my case. It's critical to remember that there were no whistleblower protections that would cover me as a private contractor. There were no proper channels through which I could have reported these concerns to individual independent actors who could review it and change these. All of the channels led to the officials who actually authorized these programs in secret, without public consent and without public knowledge. And that's a really serious concern, because when we think about the way government works in America, the way democracy works in America, and more broadly, liberal societies function around the world, they function on the principle of the consent of the governed. And, you know, consent is not meaningful if it's not informed. If officials are making decisions for us behind closed doors, they're authorizing operations on the decisions of secret courts, where the judges on those courts are all appointed by a single individual, at this time Justice John Roberts. And they all say, you know, this is okay, this is okay, this is okay. But the minute these issues hit the newspaper, the minute these issues hit the newspaper, we see something completely different. The president himself comes out on stage and says, you know what, these conversations have made us stronger. All of the review boards that are instituted find that these programs are not only dangerous to our civil liberties, to the rights that we've inherited, and to our Constitution as a document, but that they're also not necessary, that they've never stopped even a single terrorist attack.
But you basically felt the American system didn't really offer a possibility at this point for speaking out and having a fair trial and being able to put this argument across, I guess. And
well, the key there is that that decision wasn't actually made by me personally. That was made by lawyers. I've told the government again and again in negotiations, you know, that if they're prepared to offer an open trial, a fair trial, in the same way that Dan Ellsberg got, and I'm allowed to make my case to the jury, I would love to do so.
Oh, really?
But to this point, they declined.
But they won't assure you that you'd have an open trial. It would be in some kind of, I know in the Drake trial.
They want to use special procedures, basically. They want to close court. They want to use things called like Classified Information Protection Act and things like this.
Right, and then they use like sound machines to silence the person so the jury couldn't, the public couldn't hear what he was talking about at that point. So is that what you were afraid that there would be some kind of screening out of what your arguments would be?
Right. We saw this in the Thomas Drake case. This was a classic whistleblower. You actually wrote an article about him, I believe, so you should be fairly familiar with the case. And he exposed classic waste, fraud, and abuse. You know, these were classic, basically inarguable public interest issues. But they tried to railroad him. You know, they limited the arguments he could make. They limited the evidence that he could present. And they tried to put him in jail without anybody knowing or without it being able to be a public issue. Because reputations were on the line, not just reputations of individuals, but reputations of agencies. And that's a real concern, because what we begin to see is what we saw last year when James Clapper raised his hand, you know, and swore to tell the truth, and then he told a lie in front of Congress. That's a felony that's punishable by, I believe, between 5 to 7 years in prison. But he faced no consequence. He didn't face even a slap on the wrist.
So how do you account for that?
When we hold basically our most senior elite officials to one standard of behavior, but we hold the working level people, you know, the whistleblowers, to a completely different standard.
Is it another form of too big to jail?
You know, I think there is some level of truth to that. And the reality is that I wanted to rely on the people to make the decisions about what should happen. And asylum claims were a great way to litigate that, while the U.S. government, you know, decided how it really felt about these issues. But
I think
the too big to jail thing is something that we see spreading throughout society. As you mentioned, it's not just in the national security sector. We see it in the banking sector and so on and so forth.
I mean, part of the reason I wanted to go over this ancient history was that the film, I think, which I hope people see, is really fascinating. But you can see it's this changing, evolving situation that's sort of extraordinary, And one of the things that came out of it, which has caused, I think, you a lot of tough questions from people, was that you ended up first year in China and then you end up in Moscow, neither of which country is famous for its civil liberties. And so,
I think that's putting it graciously.
Okay, and so because of that, I think people have, they've certainly made people wonder, well, why those choices? And I think what I took away from watching the movie was that it was this just kind of crazy work in progress. But I wanted to know. I assume maybe it was from Greenwald's book that you chose Hong Kong because it has a tradition of asylum, and that Moscow, it seems, was hopefully a way station. Is that fair to say?
Well, so I never planned to stay in Moscow. I was actually just transiting. I had a ticket on a plane that was actually headed to Latin America. There were journalists on the plane. They took pictures of my seat because Aeroflot, I guess, leaked my seat number. There's a little bit of irony there. But what happened was after I departed Hong Kong, the State Department froze my passport. So when I landed in Russia, I wasn't able to leave. I didn't at the same time want to put in an asylum claim. I wanted to continue. And, I wondered about that. I wondered about the reasoning for the State Department, why they would want me to be in Russia, particularly when on TV at the time they were saying, this guy knows all this information. He's got millions of documents, which was actually not true. I had actually destroyed the documents that I held after I turned them over to the journalists. And I was asking myself, why was this happening? And then, the more I talked to people in the civil liberties community and the activist community about what was going on, the clearer it became that this was actually a political strategy. I had told the government, that I wasn't going to be trying to blackmail them to do anything like this. And they believed me. And they realized that by putting me in Russia, they actually diminished my voice, and they enabled a very powerful attack that would not be going away. So formerly I worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, undercover overseas. So I know a little bit about how this works. If I had been the director of CIA or the FBI or the NSA, sitting at the National Security Council, the round table at the White House, in the Situation Room, going, how do we get this guy? The very best thing they could have done was allowed me to transit in Latin America, because the CIA has a very powerful presence there, and the governments and the security services there are relatively much less capable than, say, Russia, who, nobody would be surprised to know has been in the spying game for quite some time. So why did they stop me from going someplace? They could have basically snatched me and then put me on a boat and rendered me to whatever fate they thought was appropriate, and instead kept me in the place where it would be the most difficult for them to get me. And that's a question where I'm not sure we'll ever get an official answer, a written answer. But I think it's important to look at that and question why. Why would that be in the government's interest? What were they really trying to do there? One thing that's also somewhat, I think, less well known about that period was when it was leaked that I was considering going to Latin America, trying to find some method of getting there to depart Russia. And the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, had been at a diplomatic summit in Moscow to discuss a gas deal or something like that. He made publicly a claim where he said he'd be willing to consider granting me asylum. And this was when it was the issue of the day and the news was covering it. And amazingly, when his plane departed, and I was still stranded at Sheremetyevo Moscow airport, his plane was grounded. The airspace of, I think, 3 countries, Italy, France, and Spain, was closed to his plane specifically, which is actually a violation of international law because it's a diplomatic flight carrying a head of state. And he was forced to the ground. And when he got on the ground in Austria, the American ambassador was there, and there was a lot of things. And it turned out they wanted to search the plane to see if I was on board. So it was really, there were some unprecedented activities that happened to keep me from departing Russia.
We'll get off the subject of Moscow, but I just curious, do you feel safe there?
My thinking has really advanced. Anyone who sees the documentary will realize that as you said, there wasn't a plan. My whole mission was to get this information back to the public. Once that was done, I didn't really think about what was going to happen to me. Everybody hopes for a happy ending, but I didn't plan it out. I didn't have this great mastermind strategy. I just hoped for the best, and I hoped that the public would understand why I did what I did, and we could get a resolution that society as a whole would agree on. But to nowadays, as I've done more and more, and I've seen how people have responded to this, and how important our rights are to people, even when they're constantly coming under threat from new and new policies and prerogatives from government. And it's important for people to remember this is not just about the United States. Governments around the world are engaged in this kind of behavior, and we really have to push back. Is that if something happens to me personally in the pursuit of my work, that's something that I have to be willing to accept, or I'll never have the impact that I want to have. I have to be willing to take risks and accept the fact that, I'm one small guy. I'm an ordinary person in an incredibly unusual circumstance, and there's no way I'm going to be safe. But the work is worth it.
Well, this is one of the questions that I had, and when we asked for questions from the audience they had, is about the work being worth it. And I think, people wonder how you feel about the incredible sacrifice you've made. Most people think that living in Hawaii with a high-paying job and a nice house and girlfriend, it might have been sort of nirvana, and you made an unusual choice. And so the question is whether it has been worth it and whether the country has responded in the way that's made it worth it. You've said at various points that your greatest fear would be that people wouldn't care and that there might be apathy in the face of these revelations. So are you feeling that you're getting the reaction that has made it worthwhile so far?
For me, it was never about, dictating outcomes. It was never about saying what would happen. It was about getting the information back to people so they could decide if it matters and decide if they care about it. And on that account, on that question, I think I could not have been more wrong in thinking that people wouldn't care. I mean, we've seen an extraordinary debate. All of the polling of opinions show that people care more about their civil liberties now than they ever have in the post 9/11 period. And it's because we thought about these things and we realized they were possible, but they were abstract. They seemed a little bit like conspiracy theories. We didn't honestly imagine that governments out there were collecting all of our emails, collecting all of our phone calls, and actually analyzing them to understand what we were doing. And when we found out that that was in fact the case, I think that changed the game for a lot of people. And since then, we've seen all of these reform bills proposed in Congress. We've seen bills already passed in the House. The judicial branch, which has for years and years and years said that, we can't decide these issues. We've got to defer to the executive branch on account of the state secrets privilege. And we can't actually discuss whether this is constitutional or not because it's simply too dangerous. But after seeing, the White House appointed review boards that had complete unrestricted access to classified information, and they found that, hey, these programs have actually never stopped a terrorist attack. They've never shown any concrete value at all. All the branches of government pay attention to this kind of thing, and society more broadly notices this. The very first open court to consider the constitutionality of these programs said it was likely unconstitutional. And this is after years of secret courts saying, we're not even going to consider the constitutionality of the questions. We're just going to approve the program. The President of the United States of America got up on stage and he said, we need to make reforms. We need to change the way this is done. And although he hasn't gone as far as I necessarily think would be important, that's not my decision to make. And for him to say this is a debate that makes this country stronger, I think is very important for everybody who believes that our rights matter, that our Constitution matters, and that intelligence agencies, even if they have good intentions, can go too far. And
Well,
when they violate the Constitution on a massive scale, that matters, and people need to be held to account for it.
I mean, it's interesting that you talk about how the president said this is a debate worth having, but meanwhile we had the national security community saying that these disclosures had just done egregious harm at first, and they seem to have backed off of that somewhat in more recent times. Have you noticed a little bit of retrenchment there?
I have. I've noticed it, and it's extraordinary. I think some level of explanation to that is the people making those statements were the officials who were personally implicated in authorizing the programs. When Keith Alexander, who oversaw, this massive unrestricted dragnet of Americans' communications being monitored, he said this will cause grave and irreversible harm to national security. But then he was pushed out of the agency and replaced with the new director of the National Security Agency, Michael Rogers. And he said, from his chair, and again, he's on top of the National Security Agency, he doesn't see the sky falling. This is not so serious. We will continue to do necessary work, and we will continue to succeed. And remember, I was an analyst at the National Security Agency on top of an engineer. I actually used these systems for monitoring targets. So I was aware, generally, I think much more so than the average commentator, about where the lines could be drawn and where would be going too far in exposing things that could actually cause real harm. And I tried my best to do that. At the same time, I recognize that nobody sees the full picture. I have my own biases. I am fallible. I could make mistakes and draw that balance wrong. And that's the reason I have never published a single document about the National Security Agency. I haven't revealed any news or new details. I've instead entrusted that to American journalists and said, look, you guys are the ultimate guardians of the public interest. When the system breaks down, you are the fourth estate that helps us right the ship. You veer us back on track. So what I want you to do is look at these, think very hard about what in these documents would serve the public interest for us to know, and what goes simply too far. And then beyond that, add an additional layer of checks by consulting with the government to ensure that maybe there's some information in those documents that you can't recognize the importance of, and give them an opportunity to say, hey, this will put some at risk. Don't print this. And in every single case where the government's presented some kind of compelling argument there, we've seen that happen. And in other cases where the government simply made an empty claim, the press has gone, we appreciate your input, but the public really needs to know about that. And I think that's the reason that the stories won the Pulitzer Prize for public service.
Have you, when you made this handover of the material to the 3 reporters that you chose to work with, did you discuss where you would draw that line, and have they at any point disappointed you of any of the disclosures from your standpoint gone too far? I know that I ask this because I think there was one comment that I read about from Bill Binney, who is a national security analyst, cryptographer, I think. You would know better than I. I'm just definitely in over my head on these issues. But he did say that he felt that some of the disclosures about
had gone too far. Yeah, I actually remember that quote. And Bill, since then, has said, the reporting that came out at that time was a little mischaracterized, and the way he had heard it was not quite accurate, because it was described as, I think as he heard it, as revealing penetrations the NSA had into Chinese military institutions and things like that, and that was in fact not accurate. It was about penetrations into public universities, into hospitals, into critical infrastructure that doesn't just put people overseas at risk, it puts Americans at risk. Because we've seen a lot of stories where some people would say it's about foreign spying. For example, there was one where it was found the National Security Agency used executive authorities. Those are authorities that are not authorized by law. They're simply the president says, let's do this, and they do it. To hack in to the private networks of American companies, which in itself is legally questionable, and provide themselves secret access to the networks of, I believe it was Google and Yahoo. It could have been other companies. But it's these kind of things where the NSA justified it as saying, well, these actions took place overseas, but they're affecting American companies on which hundreds of millions of Americans' communications transit every day. And it's happening without the awareness of Congress, because spying programs that happen that are authorized under executive authorities are not required to be presented to the congressional oversight committees. And not everyone is aware about that. But that creates real blind spots in our methods of governance when it comes to spying. And if we don't know about that, if we simply say, because this happened outside the borders of the United States, we should never know about it, we're exposing ourselves to a lot of danger of intrusion and abrogation and erosion of our rights, because we live in an interconnected world. American communications do not stop at the border. You hit websites overseas, you buy services and products overseas, and your communications, even if they're going from Utah to Maryland, can actually travel all the way around the world before they make that trip. So we have to be really careful about how we draw that. And while the question that you asked more specifically was, do I agree with all of the stories that the journalists have presented? I don't. I would draw those lines a little differently, and I think much more conservatively than some of the journalists have had. But it's not my place to decide what should be published and what shouldn't. That is the role of our press and our representatives in Congress.
So in drawing the line, is your standard basically protecting lives, sources, methods, those kinds of those sorts of lines, or how do you? You have such an incredible mass of information. How would you decide where to draw the line between security and secrecy on it?
Well, the ultimate question is the public interest. Does this make a difference? Is it something that the public needs to know to make an informed decision about the policies and prerogatives of our government? If it's about secret programs that affect our rights, that affect our economy and things like that, that could cost American jobs, that could cost American lives, we need to be careful about how we handle that information. But at the same time, we have to know about some things if the trend is likely to cause more damage in the future than if we didn't know about it and allowed these programs to fester in the dark without our knowledge and consent.
It seemed like one of the issues that came up that's mentioned in the film that troubled you was the information you began to get about the U.S. drone program. Was there a particular, tell me, reason, I'm curious about what you saw that made you think that there were concerns people should have. Do you feel it's too secretive and the public needs to have more buy-in to it, or there should be more transparency about the casualties, or what was it that you were looking at that worried you?
Ultimately, what concerned me, what really made me cross the line between going, this is a concern and this is something that actually moves people to action. It provided me with a duty to act, to stand up and say something about this, was the deception of government officials. We can have secret programs. The American people don't have to know the name of every individual that's under investigation. We don't need to know the technical details of absolutely every program in the intelligence community. But we do have to know the bare and broad outlines of the powers that our government is claiming broadly and how they affect us and how they affect our relationships overseas. Because if we don't, we are no longer citizens. We no longer have leaders. We're subjects and we have rulers. Democracy is about participation. And if we're denied the information that we need in order to vote about the policies that we want in this country and the boundaries of our rights that we as a people think are appropriate, we're no longer really free. We're beginning sort of a descent into a less free, less liberal, and more authoritarian society. And when that descent begins, it's very difficult to reverse. When the government claims a new power, when the government institutes a new program, it's very difficult to get them to give it up, regardless of whether it was legal, regardless of whether it was lawful. For example, in the Bush administration, we had a warrantless wiretapping program that was it was unlawful. The DOJ agreed that there was no statutory constitutional basis authorizing the program, and that it should be shut down. When that happened, however, what we actually saw was, despite the fact that the program was considered unconstitutional, The DOJ said they wouldn't back it. The president had his cabinet go to the director of national security at the time, Michael Hayden, in secret, and ask him, would he authorize the program without a statutory basis if the president requested it? And he thought about this, and this is detailed in a classified document called the Inspector General's Report on Stellar Wind, published in the Washington Post last year. And he said yes. Regardless of whether it had a statutory or constitutional basis, if the president requested it, he would do it. And that's really the challenge. What happens when our government, when our most senior officials use secrecy to unchain themselves from accountability to law and democracy? And if we allow that to happen, that's really a road we don't come back from.
Well, I know that, or at least I've read that in 2008, you were very hopeful that some of those abuses of power that took place during those years, in the Bush years, would be corrected. And we have a different administration with a different point of view that is at the very helm of which is a constitutional law professor. And so I know that I don't want to put you on the spot in a place that's uncomfortable to be, given that you may have to negotiate with the same administration. But how are you, I suppose I wonder, how are you feeling about the possibility that there really will be reform within the spectrum as we know it from Democrat to Republican in the U.S. governments?
You know, regardless of negotiations, regardless of the relationship between myself and the administration, whether it's adversarial or cooperative, ultimately I don't think it's my place. You know, I'm not going to put it upon myself to advise the president as to what he should or should not do. That's a role for the public, you know, for our institutions of the press, for us as a community, us as a society, to decide what kind of things we believe in and hold our representatives to account in demanding that they actually champion those policies as opposed to those which would be most convenient for them at the time, whether that's politically or reputationally. In terms of will we get reform, I think this is the question that's actually not just on the public's mind, but on historians' minds. Because when we look at the changes to policy that happened in the Bush administration, the authorization of torture, warrantless wiretapping, the unitary executive theory, and basically the idea that more and more we as the sole superpower should begin accepting ourselves from the rules and standards of behavior that we set ourselves for the rest of the world. It's something that should change. And if that's the case, when we look at the surveillance revelations, you know, all the things about mass surveillance that we learned in 2013, they provide a mandate for change. And the question is whether or not that mandate will be used, or whether history will record that as a point where we had an opportunity to change, but our chose not to do so.
People have said that whistleblowers generally are moved to disclose crimes, and one of the complicated situations that you're in is that what you revealed was not a crime, but maybe a moral or ethical or political crime in some ways in the way you looked at it. Do you feel that leaking was the only form of check and balance that could have corrected this?
Well, there is definitely a point in every institution and every process where the final check on the abuse of power is whistleblowing. However, I would dispute that there have been no crimes shown. In fact, we've seen serial violations of law. In the wake of these revelations, we had people testify to Congress that I believe more than 12 times NSA employees had used these surveillance powers to spy on exes, to spy on lovers, and that's a felony. However, none of them were prosecuted because it was considered that the value of the programs was greater than the interest of justice in basically punishing people who had violated the law. The false claims of senior officials to Congress was probably one of the most serious crimes that a government official can commit. And that was only revealed by the revelations that we saw in the investigations that followed them up. Beyond that, these programs themselves are unconstitutional. Again, the very first judge who ruled on this found that they were likely unconstitutional. It will go to the Supreme Court, and I am confident that the Supreme Court will agree that these programs went too far. The problem with this is, and what critics claim, the people who are supporting mass surveillance claim, is that if these things are authorized by statute in this way or that way or the other, the Constitution doesn't really matter, because the Constitution does not assign penalties for violations. But our system of government is founded upon the principle that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So when we say that, yes, a statute may have not been violated in this particular instance of this particular case, when you look at the totality of circumstance, it is very clear that several different amendments of the Constitution, whether it's our right to freely associate under the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, has been violated on a massive and unprecedented scale. A system of surveillance that is unauthorized by any kind of constitutional authority has never existed in this country in this manner. And we've seen public intellectuals, we've seen lawyers, we've seen specialists from all areas of society agree that this is the case. And were this not the case, were it found that these programs were indeed constitutional, that this was indeed authorized by statute, and that the government could simply invest itself in secret with the power to watch all of us without limit, store 5-year records of our behaviors, and retroactively investigate us at will, I would argue that it is still proper and still correct to reveal these programs because of the strength of the response. Ultimately, governments exist for the benefit of the public. And if they are no longer serving our needs, if they are working contrary to the public interest, as opposed to working to further the public interest, that's something that we deserve to know. That's something more than we deserve to know, that we have a right to know. And when officials in the American government are asked to swear an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, I believe they're bound to stand up and act when they see this kind of behavior and do something about it. And I could be wrong, and I'm willing to face history's judgment for that. But I stand by that decision, and I think the reaction of the public, the fact that the internet of the structure of the internet since that period has changed, shows that there is a lot of agreement, and I am not alone in taking that position.
And it seems Silicon Valley is, to some extent, also trying to make some changes, correct? In trying to close some of the back doors that the government has used to spy on users. Right. And the government is still arguing that this is going to cause egregious harm and that they won't be able to keep people safe from. They've used, examples of child predators and things like that. Are you worried at all about whether or not they need to be able to get into people's, Google and Yahoo, Apple, whatever, in order to keep the public safe?
So I have a somewhat unique perspective on this because I was specifically hired to basically hack hackers for the NSA. So I've gone after hard targets. I know how they operate. I'm obviously quite familiar with encryption myself, given the fact that the NSA publicly claims they still have no idea what happened. But we'll leave that there. The reality is that encryption is not something that prevents the investigation that properly authorized law enforcement investigations. If you are a criminal and you encrypt your phone, and I suspect you of a crime, I can go to a judge. I can present a showing of probable cause, get a judicial warrant that will allow me to use law enforcement tools to gain total access to your phone. Even if that phone is encrypted, even if there are pictures, even if there are messages on it that are protected by the strongest encryption that exists today, the key has to exist somewhere on that phone when the user, the criminal in this case, is viewing those pictures, viewing those documents, or they themselves would not be able to read it. Encrypted data, when it's not paired with the key, is illegible. It's garbage. It's just junk data. So when we're talking about investigating someone who's using this information for a crime, they're storing evidence and things like that, as soon as they access that data is available to law enforcement if they go through proper procedures and use proper tools to steal the key that is then able to decrypt that information. So beyond that, even if encryption were, let's say, this unbreakable, impenetrable shield that law enforcement couldn't get around on the phone, we live in the cloud era. When you take a picture on your iPhone, it gets uploaded to their service called the iCloud. That data is not encrypted. That data is available to, Apple can respond to a subpoena from the FBI and provide a copy of that. When you make a phone call with an encrypted phone, the phone records there don't go to Apple, they don't go to Samsung, they don't go to these other phone manufacturers, they go to AT&T, they go to Verizon, they go to Time Warner or whoever you use for your services, for your television, your internet, your phone. And again, these are unencrypted. They're available to law enforcement. Your phone is only a gateway into these different networks. The transmission of information is not controlled by you. Your phone can be encrypted all day long, but it's just a gateway into a global network that's being comprehensively and sometimes unlawfully monitored in a way that we've never seen before in human history. So for law enforcement agencies to complain and say, we're concerned we're not going to be able to gather information in our investigations is not just ridiculous, but it's actually offensive, because it implies that they're not more powerful now than they have been before. And when we look at their classified documents, what they're saying in private as opposed to in secret, which we now have a rare chance to do, we see that they call today the golden age of signals intelligence. They say we have access to more information more easily than we ever have before.
Okay, I have a few questions now that fall into a category that I know is not the favorite of anybody at the NSA, where personal is described as, or extroverts are described as the person. When you're talking, you look at the other person's shoes, right? That's the extrovert, as opposed to your own. And so it's not a place known for chattiness. But I just wanted to ask you a couple sort of mild questions about your life. One is, what you miss most about America at this point.
I mean, the only question, whenever I think about that, the question is, what don't I miss? Whether it's my family, whether it's my home, whether it's my friends, whether it's my work at the agency. I was fulfilled and happy. I think it's critical to remember that the revelations of last year, the actions that I took, were not specifically about surveillance. That's a misreading. It's not a complaint about policy. It's about the accountability of government. It's about the relationship between the governing and those who are being governed. And if we allow that to slip, we lose what our country is. So I was willing to make sacrifices because I wanted everybody else who I loved and that I had around me, whether they were family, whether they were friends, whether they were simply people who lived in the same country I did, I wanted them to enjoy the same things, that we've always had going forward, that we are beginning to see come increasingly under threat. So yeah, I mean, things as simple as having my old beat-up car. There's a lot to miss. It's a great country.
I wondered, after realizing from watching Citizen4 that you had to take off without telling your significant other, Lindsay Mills, that you would not be seeing her possibly for the rest of your life. When you did get back together, was she mad?
I'll leave that to the investigative journalists to see if they can puzzle that one out.
Come on, just a...
Yes, she was not entirely pleased, but at the same time, it was an incredible reunion because she understood, and that meant a lot to me. So many people from so many parts of society, they go, they may not agree with everything that I did, they may not agree with the way I did it, but they do agree with the principle. They believe that in America, government answers to the public. And when that changes, it's no longer America. So although she had a very, very challenging year, and I'll leave it to her to discuss that when and if she's ever ready, it was a meeting I'll never forget.
And can you imagine possibly staying in Russia forever?
I'll do what needs to be done to continue my work. At this point, the issues have so vastly overshadowed what I do that I feel like I have a lot more flexibility. I have a lot of disagreements with the policy of the Russian government. I think they do some horrible, atrocious things, particularly when it comes to the right to privacy and the manner in which they go about surveillance, the extent they do that, and the way we see that affecting journalism and public opinion. But ultimately, I answer to my country, and the way things go, the policies of my government. Maybe one day, if I speak fluent Russian, I know everything about Russian society and their politics, I'll be able to engage more fully. But my first duty is my own people.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one other question, and then maybe go to the ones from the people in the audience. I wondered, as just because of the choices you made were so unusual, to stand up and take these risks. Was there anything in your childhood or growing up that inspired you to do this? I mean, were there models in mind, or even your own family, or what was it, do you think, that made you separate yourself from everyone else who just kind of keeps going ahead without doing these things?
I think nobody really knows. None of us are masters of our own psychology. We don't know what shaped us. We don't know what drove us to make the decisions that we made. But my entire family worked for the federal government, going back to grandparents and things like that, and particularly in the military. I signed up for the Army in the wake of September 11th and volunteered to participate in the Iraq War because I believed the claims of our government. And that was something that I think was uniform throughout my family. So as I became more and more senior, as I climbed up through the ranks, as I joined the CIA, as I later worked for the NSA, and I gained access to the absolute highest levels of classification, and I realized that anybody, could use these programs, that they had extraordinary capabilities, that nobody knew about them for the public, that they had not been authorized by the public, and the fact that really pushed me over the edge was that the officials in government that did know about this were willing to directly lie to the public about it. It showed to me that they were not acting in a manner consistent with the government that the principles that I and my family and everyone else in this country swore their loyalty to. If they're going to ask us to pledge allegiance to the flag every day in school, they had better hold themselves to the principles that the flag represents. Because if they don't, they're asking for trouble.
Well, I guess they got it. Okay, I'm going to read you a couple of questions from the audience. Some people left their names and some did not. This is a question from someone named Ellen Corso, and she says, in true New Yorker festival style, I do not actually have a question. I would like to tell you something. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did, and thank you for your sacrifice, and I really appreciate it, and I think that you are a hero. And I hope that you are able to find refuge in a more pleasant spot soon. But then she says, but maybe I do have a question. How are you supporting yourself?
So I've been incredibly fortunate to have support from so many people from around the world, whether they're civil liberties organizations, whether they're private individuals, whether it's crowdsourcing donations for my defense funds and things like that. I'm actually working on a very significant grant to work for a foundation creating, I don't know how much I should reveal at this point because I think they'd prefer to do it. But to work for the benefit of the press and journalists who are working in threatened areas. And by threatened areas, I don't mean just, the James Rosens who are getting their phone records subpoenaed by the Department of Justice. I mean people, in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean people in regimes where journalists get shot, they don't get indicted. How they can continue their work, and it's been incredibly rewarding. I'll leave it at that. And if I could actually respond to she called me a hero, and I really appreciate that. I appreciate the support that everyone's given me, but I think it's important that we remember that I'm an ordinary guy. I'm not a hero, and I would argue that there are no heroes. There are people who do heroic things, but when we begin to label people as heroes, what we're doing is we're otherizing them, we're elevating them, we're putting them on a pedestal and saying they're different. I could never do that. But the reality is you can do that. We can all do that. We all have a line. There's a measure of incivility and inhumanity that we all can tolerate, and then there's one step beyond it that we cannot. And all we have to do is recognize where that line is, recognize what we believe, and commit ourselves not just to believing in it, but to standing for it when it comes under threat.
Thank you. Okay, from Ariana Marini. She says, a great deal of discussion has gone on about whether you did the right or wrong thing, Mr. Snowden. At my college, we had a 3-hour panel discussion regarding whether you were a hero or a traitor. Do you ever regret leaking the NSA documents?
No, I have not regretted it at all. I think, in fact, what has happened since has shown us that it was critical to do, and that had I not done it personally, someone else would have. The question was not, would this be revealed, but when would it be revealed? The public had to know about this. And there were, I know for a fact from my internal discussions where I told colleagues, you know, do you see what's going on? Do you know what's going on here? You know, how do you feel about this? And they were appalled. You know, they thought the same thing. When they saw the boundless informant heat map of the NSA's global collection that shows how much we're collecting, in what areas, how many communications we're intercepting on Americans, on Germans, on Russians, and so on and so forth, which, by the way, the NSA told Congress it did not have that capability and could not do it, even though the tool was available to anyone with a top secret clearance on the NSA's network. When they saw that, and they looked at the statistics, and they saw that we were collecting and intercepting and monitoring more American communications than we were Russian communications. You know, people go, where did we misplace our priorities? Why is this happening? So it's, I don't think as controversial as some commentators in the media have made it out to be. A lot of what we've seen in the last year has been opinion shaping. You know, we've had a lot of very senior officials going up on Sunday shows, giving anonymous comments to the press, trying to say, hey, this causes damage, this causes damage, this causes damage. But we've had court cases, we've had independent review boards, which were appointed by the White House, right? They're not appointing adversaries here; they're appointing partners, and people who have gone before Congress. You know, these officials have been trotted out, and despite full access to classified information, not something, you know, we're not talking about situations where they've gone, we can't tell you about it because if we made it public, it would cause harm. And they've been asked, has this caused any individual instance of harm at all? Can you give us one example of where this hurt things? And they've never been able to show that. So the question is, if this was so damaging, and the government has every incentive to show us and to make the case, to get the public instead to back these programs instead of condemn them, and to get us to give up more of our rights to make these programs more capable, more efficient, why have they not done so? And the reality is because it hasn't happened. We have been incredibly careful, and by we I mean myself, I mean the journalists, I mean all of the people involved in the review, including the government itself. Because every story that's appeared in the newspaper, the government has had a chance to review, provide comment on, and say, look, this goes too far, this is going to cause harm. And every story that you've read in the paper is there because the government said, you know, ultimately we're not going to like this, but it's not going to hurt anything.
Okay, this is from Jennifer Chow, and she says, what are your suggestions for how people can protect themselves and their privacy?
So this is an incredibly complex topic, and because I understand this on a technical level, you know, I could talk for the next 9 hours about this, and everybody would fall asleep and hate me. But the basic principles are, first off, we have to champion reform domestically and go, when we say, you know, I don't worry about this, I don't have anything to hide, so I'm not afraid of them, you know, reading my emails and collecting all of the books I read at Amazon, seeing all of my friends and when I call them and where I go and what I do. Because what you're saying with this is you're inverting the model of responsibility for how rights work. When you say, I have nothing to hide, you're saying, I don't care about this right. You're saying, I don't have this right because I've got to the point where I have to justify it. The way rights work is the government has to justify its intrusion into your rights. You don't have to justify why you need freedom of speech. You don't have to justify why you need the right to be left alone without any kind of reasonable suspicion or probable cause. So we have to establish that. We have to say that we value our rights, and the same rights that we inherited, our children deserve to inherit the same way. But ultimately, we have to remember that political reform in the United States is not going to solve the problem globally, because governments around the world, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Asia, they're going to have their own national laws. And that's, you know, these can be terrible governments where they go, we don't care about your rights. We're going to intercept everything we can. So because of that, you have to use secure communications. And that's a very complex technical topic. But the real key is companies that are willing to collaborate with any government to compromise the security of their products and services do not deserve to be trusted with your data. Because if they'll do it for one government, they'll do it for another government. And governments don't play by the same rules. They, in fact, have to. Because if a government makes an exception for the United States government, they'll have to do the same thing for the Indian government, the Chinese government, the Russian government, the French government. Otherwise, they'll be sanctioned in that country. You know, they'll face some kind of response. They won't be able to get licensed. They won't get regulatory approvals. So when we see things that we've recently seen where senior officials in government, you know, the FBI director, the attorney general come out and they say, oh my goodness, Apple is saying they're going to increase the security of their phones. We can't allow that. We want to basically mandate that they're going to have to compromise their security of their devices. That has incredible knock-on effects, not just for Apple, but for the country. Because the same way that nobody's going to put their money in a bank that's most famous for stealing from its clients, nobody's going to buy phones from a company that compromises the security of them so they can be eavesdropped on, particularly when we talk about a global economy. No German is going to buy an American phone with a back door in it that allows anybody to listen in, when they can buy a Korean phone or a German phone that does the same exact thing but is actually secure. So that's going to cost us jobs if we don't do anything about it. That's going to cost us economic competitiveness, and that's really going to have a knock-on effect. So you've got to support secure products and services, but you also have to recognize that some of the technologies that we need have not been developed, they have not been popularized, they have not been made easy to use. And you need to support efforts and research into those. I speak with cryptographers and computer scientists every day to try to figure out how we can create solutions to the metadata problem, which is the fact that signaling information, who you called, when you called, then what websites you visit, but not necessarily you know, what you said on the phone call. That information is very difficult on a technological basis to protect without associating efficiency costs, but we get kind of technical there. But there are solutions, there are ways forward, and we need to pursue them. We need to work toward them. And we need to say that this is an effort worth doing. What the last year represented was the atomic moment for computer scientists. It was the loss of innocence for a generation of professionals who were creating new advancements, who were researching new technologies that they intended to be used to bring people closer together, to create more liberal, more interconnected, more free societies. And we realized that in secret they were being subverted to contrary purposes. And just as would happen with physicists, I think we're going to see the political radicalization of a class of professionals that will be able to, I think, better protect us as a society and step us back from the brink of conflict that we had during the Cold War with nuclear weapons that we have today with electronic conflict.
Well, another person who wrote in had a similar question, but it was following up on that. What can an ordinary person who's not a computer genius do? They want to know what can they do to help further this cause of more openness in the country and pushing back on sort of mass surveillance. So do you have any thoughts about what people can do?
The first thing you can do is search for encrypted communications programs, because what encryption does on a basic level, what secure communications programs do, is they simply enforce your rights on the technical level as opposed to the statutory level. They make sure that when your communications transit through Guatemala, it doesn't matter what the laws of Guatemala are, you will still have your rights protected to the measure that was designed into the program.
So encryption, what is
so
this?
encryption. We're talking about encryption. We're talking about dropping programs that are hostile to privacy. For example, Dropbox. Get rid of Dropbox. It doesn't support encryption. It doesn't protect your private files. And use competitors like SpiderOak that do the same exact service, but they protect the content of what you're sharing. Same thing with companies like Facebook, with companies like Google. They've made strides to increase the security of their programs, and they're getting better than they have been, but they're still not safe. These are dangerous services, and you need to use alternatives that are better encrypted. Don't send your texts unencrypted on your iPhone. Use programs like Red Phone, like Silent Circle, anything by Moxie Marlinspike and Open Whisper Systems. These are typically free programs that are better than what comes standard on your phone, and they're safer. I would say look into these, and typically they're actually getting much better, much easier to use than they used to be. You just click on it in the App Store, you download it, and then you use it.
Finally, from Kevin, what do you believe your legacy will ultimately be? And is it going to be different from what you thought it would be when you thought, okay, I have to tell the world?
That's a pretty big question, I think, to ask a 30-something.
Very.
I haven't really given much consideration to legacy.
Is it too early to tell?
Yeah, I think I'll have to leave that to historians and say that my intention is to continue to work to change the game, and to say that infringements to our rights are not inevitable with the progress of technology. We're going to continue to face new challenges. We're going to continue to face new threats. We're always going to have government officials who want to go that extra step, who want to grant themselves this extra power in secret. But civil society is more powerful today than it ever has been. And we see more and more people becoming skeptical of claims being made to us by corporations, by foundations, and by governments. And I think that's not a sign of discontent. That's a sign of a renaissance of critical thinking that will allow us to have a better, safer, and more free society as long as we participate and continue to say, hey, that sounds reasonable, but does it make sense? And what can I do to make things better than the way I found them?
Well, on an optimistic note, we can bring this to a close and let you go enjoy a vodka or whatever they do.
I actually don't drink alcohol.
A Moscow
little known fact, I've never been drunk.
You've been so nice to spend this time with all of us. Thank you so very much for everything.
Thank you. Thank you very much.